It's not a World Anvil stream without some audio issues. Greetings and salutations, you beautiful beings. I have three glorious guests who I am all ready to introduce in just a moment. But first of all, I'd like to say welcome. Welcome to this podcast live. These, of course, go live at 11 a.m. Pacific time or 7 o'clock UK time or wherever you're in the world. Now, that is now, on a Saturday, and we talk about interesting world building things. I have amazing guests, as you can see right now on my screen. And today we are talking about history. So my first guest that I will introduce is Dimitris, the developer of World Anvil, who has been building worlds and reading history since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Dimitris, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Hello, everybody. My name is Dimitris, if you don't know me, but probably here you know me. I am the developer of World Anvil, and I'm very, very happy to be here today. That's all I have to say.
Yay! Well, hopefully you have more to say later, because we are, of course, talking about the weird, wacky, unusual, and strange origins of organizations in our world. But Guy, why don't you introduce yourself? Guy is the face of the hit GM, How to Be a Great GM channel, author, screenwriter extraordinaire, award-winning everything. Guy, introduce yourself properly.
Well, I haven't yet got an award for descaling my kettle, but I will eventually get that award. I am aiming for that at the end of the year. So I've been practicing recently. But yes, my name is Guy, and I'm from How to Be a Great GM. If you don't know who I am, you don't watch enough of this channel, clearly. Anyway, yes, and I'm here talking about history because I'm old enough to have lived through a lot of it.
I don't know about that. But I can say, Guy, you're cultivating a very British accent there right now.
I am?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Well, that's what happens when you live in this country.
It's changing. It's changing. And speaking of British historians, I have, of course, Nick from Arclands, who is an author of history books as well as an author of the Arcverse. Nick, introduce yourself properly.
Hi, I'm Nick. I'm one of the founder creators of the Arclands world, and you can check out our exciting Kickstarter, which is closed now, but you can look at the pictures and videos because it's all stimulating stuff. And when I'm not creating fantasy universes, I'm a history teacher. So yes, more on that later.
Ooh, exciting! I can't wait to hear more about that. Maybe as well as some organization goodness, you could tell us some student horror stories, because they are always good for a laugh, provided you didn't live
I've
them.
brought some quality anecdotes with me tonight. Never go unprepared.
Oh man, I really freaking looking forward to it. Well, chaps, we're going to jump straight in. I've just shared the History Challenge URL in the chat, so if you don't know the challenge to which we are referring, you can see it there and take part. But stay with us for a little while, because we're going to be giving you a ton of inspiration for the history of organizations, which is, of course, what that challenge is all about. So let's start at the very beginning. The coolest or weirdest start to an organization. Almost unusual, almost epic. Dimitris, what have you got for us?
Start of an organization. Interesting question. I think that the most interesting organization I could find to think about, because you give us the question some minutes before that, actually some hours before that, was the beginning of the Republic of Venice.
Huh.
And I found it very interesting because of two reasons. First of all, you know that how Rome was built by Gauls, right? Do you know that the dude who created, in fact, the Venice Republic was called Ursus? So essentially, Venice is made of bears, which is hilarious as well. But it was very interesting because the reason that the Republic of Venice was created was because, although essentially we know very well that the other part of the Roman Empire was crumbling down and the Roman Empire was actually starting while the Byzantine was still there, the dudes in Venice was like, no, we like the Byzantines, we're going to stay with them. So they said, you know what, bugger off, Franks. We want to have our own place with our own ships and everything, and we'll be trading with these dudes. So that's how it started. It was very interesting that essentially amidst everything else, they created a city-state, one of the first ones, and also I love the fact that they made it against all odds because they just wanted to be essentially friends with the big guys. That's pretty much it. And yeah.
Cool. All right, Nick, what have you got for us on our start of an organization? Any thoughts?
Start of an organization. There were in the 1860s in Russia, just as Russia was beginning to kind of connect with the rest of the world. in much deeper ways. There were kind of waves of intellectualism that came from Europe. The first, which was Charles Darwin. It's Darwin, not Marx, really, that sort of triggered off revolutionary change in Russia. And there are some fascinating student and underground groups. There are huge swathes of young men and women who became very well educated, and they didn't have a role in the Tsarist state because sort of rather stupid noblemen's sons got all the decent jobs. So they were unhappy and angry and upset. And never leave lots of intelligent, angry people alone with nothing to do, because they'll do bad things. There's this great story about how when they wanted to assassinate a government minister, they shared a racehorse between them. There was a racehorse that was be owned by one of the little revolutionary groups, the People's Will or something like that, and they would have to go and borrow it because that was the getaway horse, which is like my favorite revolutionary anarchist story of all time. And you think, well, in Russia in the 1860s and 1870s, if you wanted to get anywhere, you had to do it by horse, and so you might as well have a fast one. So
I love that.
Yeah,
I freaking love that. Thank you so much for sharing that.
They had to cancel assassinations because someone else was using the horse.
Can you imagine the transporter, or like the Fast and Furious, but in 1870 edition Russia, with the guy like, wait, come, we go on the horse.
Well, I thought what you could do is if you wanted to do in your rival group is you give them something that you give them dob in the cart horse. That's they need a bag of oats to get it going or something like that.
I just love the idea that the rail replacement bus service was like a donkey or a badger or something.
Well, yeah, I mean it was. So there you go.
Amazing. Ed R. Andrew in the chat says horse punk. I love that idea. Guy, what have you got for us on the origins of organizations? I'm looking for the weird, the funny, the strange, or even just the interesting.
Well, this one is, as far as we know, it's true, and it involves the complete and utter destruction of an empire based on boot polish.
Huh.
Yes.
I'm intrigued.
When the British arrived on the east coast of southern Africa, it was fairly dense forest and populated by the Zulu Empire at that stage, which was in 1834 anyway, under the control of King Shaka Zulu, the famous Zulu king, who did not suffer likely these strange interlopers coming into his territory to effectively hunt ivory, which is why they were there, and to look for fresh water and that sort of thing for ships who were slowly trying to make their way towards India. Nonetheless, a group of young entrepreneurs went to seek an audience with the king, who by this stage already had some grey hair in his crown. And one of them offered to use boot polish to blacken it, which the king took as a sign of witchcraft, not knowing what boot polish was, given that the Zulu Empire did not own footwear. And as a result, he ceded them the territory which is now known as Durban, which is one of the largest East Coast cities. It's the largest East Coast harbour in Africa, as a trading point, because he was of such respect of these strange pieces of individuals. But the name given to the white traders in Zulu, which I won't pronounce, but the name means sea foam, because they had the skin colour of sea foam. So when you see the sea foam on the beach, it's sort of whitish, and that was the name that they gave to the traders. But because of boot polish, he was impressed enough to allow them to establish Durban, and ultimately that allowed the British Empire to get a foothold on that side of Africa, and that led to the Zulu War and the destruction of the Zulu people.
That's so cool. That is so very cool. I love that. Okay, so mine in contrast is something that definitely didn't happen. Because, you guys have given us stuff that did happen, and I love that. I've chosen a myth as an organizational beginning, and that is the myth of Romulus and Remus. Now, I won't recount it now. It's absolutely, if you search for Romulus and Remus, that is Romulus and Remus, you will find hundreds and hundreds of retelling of this myth. But essentially, the idea is that Rome was founded on the basis that two little boys were suckled by a wolf when they were abandoned in a world. It's very weird, But that legend persisted so long that coins from Rome had that lady wolf with the Romulus and Remus babies suckling on her. It was a very, very powerful origin story. It was a very, very powerful icon that persisted long into the span of the Roman Empire. And I mean, yes, it was completely made up, but sometimes, and this is kind of the point that I wanted to make with this, sometimes that doesn't matter for a history. Sometimes the power of the myth of where an organization comes from is way more important than actually 3 people sat down in an office and said, oh, well, I think we need to do something about the trains. Do you know, we do need to do something about the trains. Yes, let's do something about the trains. And they have a very serious, sensible conversation. That power of story can be incredible, and it can change over time. And that's what's called reception history, as people sort of reinterpret it to repurpose it politically. So we have basically Venice's Build-A-Bear, bring your horse for the getaway, and boot polish can get you territory. That's what we've learned from this. And tell stories, they're powerful. Good, okay, so we have the founding, some ideas for the founding of our organizations. I saw someone throwing in the myth of the origin of the Knights Templar there as well in the chat. Fantastic. And guys, feel free to share your own anecdotes, your own stories, and your own ideas as well. We are all sharing our ideas so that we can all get inspired for our history challenge, which is running right now on World Anvil. But let's jump to my next question, because this always goes terribly a lot faster than I think it will. Most revolutionary moment in an organization. Things that changed. Moments that changed things. You could wait. Did I or the most transformative moment? So I've sort of I think I phrased it that way, didn't I? Most transformative moment before. I saw your scared faces and I was like, maybe I've misphrased this question. It's good. The guy is very easy to read. I like that. So I am looking for transformative or revolutionary or interesting moment in which an organization changed or developed or grew suddenly, something like that. What do you think, Guy?
When an organization changed revolutionarily.
Or transformed or developed or grew or altered from its original purpose.
Okay. Does this have to be, this was something that I forgot to ask you. Does this have to build on the previous thing?
No, as I said.
Okay, good.
As I said,
right,
any anecdotes, fair game.
Lovely. Then we're going to shift our focus to about the 16 or 1700s mainland China, where it could be a little bit later than that, actually. I'm not entirely specific on the dates. Tea had become incredibly popular in England as a drink. But the way that the Chinese drink tea, which is one of the primary resources that supplied a lot of the tea, as well as the rest of those areas that the tea was being brought from, was not conducive to how ladies of society would prefer to drink tea, which is with delicate hands and acting as if their hands weren't on fire because of the boiling water that was used to make the tea. So they needed something to hold it with, hence the invention of the handle of the cup. And as a result, the entire industry of producing china, that stuff that we use for making dishes and teapots and fancy teas, drinking mugs, or just, those things completely changed because the Chinese went, oh, you want handles on your teacups? We shall now put handles on your teacups. And it literally changed how the Chinese industry of porcelain production was operated. And they added handles to everything that they possibly could, because that's what the markets demanded. And what was interesting about that whole entire production process was that in China, there would be a village that the entire village would be dedicated to producing a single dinner service. So grandpa would be the one who would throw the plates. Then grandma would be the one who painted the plates. Then son would do the firing. Then mother would do the teacups. Then son junior would do the this and the that and the next. So that effectively what would happen was every month they would send crates of this porcelain to the harbors, which would then get loaded up onto the ships and then taken off to Europe.
Amazing.
But the tea handle, the actual handle itself, that's not an Oriental thing at all. They have a handle on a pot, but not on the side of a cup. And that changed the entire industry completely.
Fascinating. So the organizations that affected were families and
Well, yeah, and what makes it even more interesting, I don't want to take up too much time, but what makes it more interesting was that the Europeans were not allowed onto mainland China.
Of course.
So they had to go through intermediaries. So they had to describe to the intermediary the idea of the handle, and the intermediary then had to go to their supplier and say, no, we actually want a handle put on. So you have this wonderful broken line of communication to get a handle added so that someone sitting on the other side of the world could drink their hot tea without screaming and looking like a banshee, basically.
Which so unladylike. So unladylike
exactly.
when one scalds one's knees.
Yes.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love
black
that.
teeth and not hot tea.
The changes in culture halfway across the world can completely change the daily lives and the industry and the steps of industry of another place in rural China. That is such a cool example. I love that. Nick, what have you got for me on revolutionary or transformative?
Transformative. Well, I suppose transformative moments in organisations come around because of the transition in ideas, and I think what's interesting to note is that if you're like me, I'm 46 now. I was 46 this year, so the majority of my life has been lived throughout basically a revolution. There's been a revolution going on since 1979. And the reason why that I say that is because we've lived through a revolution in this thing called conservatism, which we seem to be perpetually living with. Conservatism, if you go back to the French Revolution, when it began as an idea, there were commentators like Edmund Burke, who was a liberal, a Whig parliamentarian in Ireland, who was looking at France and said, this is terrible. And he said, basically, radical change is a bad thing. The ordinary person is a kind of an angry brute, and you've got to really keep them under control to keep the structure of society as it should be, and then violent things won't happen, and then there'll be a kind of a general good outcome for everybody. But conservatism itself, probably in about the mid-1960s, particularly in America, stopped believing that. And what the conservatism that emerged under Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and people like them around the world was rip it up and start again. It was essentially a kind of a revolutionary idea, not a kind of emancipatory revolution. It's a revolution that involves massive flows of wealth upwards, but certainly is a revolution. So wherever you go in the world, you find parties that think of themselves as conservatives, but they constantly talk about extremely radical ideas. If you think of a conservative prime minister in Britain in the 1950s, someone like Harold Macmillan, he was essentially a paternalist Tory, make sure that the working man is reasonably well kept. And then you won't have these frightening revolutions that we've lived through in the 20th century. But now, they don't really kind of operate along those lines at all. Though a great many people that vote for conservative parties still assume that's essentially the ideology. And the injection of the marketization of all aspects of society and the financialization of all aspects of society has created, revolutionary change, but in a funny way, revolutionary change that we've lived through quite slowly, because it's been part of our lives. And so when people think, you can't leave your back door open these days, the neighborhood isn't as it was, and all that kind of stuff, it's like, well, yeah, there's a reason for that, because of this vast ideological change we've all lived through. So fascinating. Sorry, I go on, don't I? I go on.
Oh, very cool.
You are in a call of chatters. I am notoriously bad for chatting, and I think I can't see a single person in here that doesn't enjoy the long form conversation. And honestly, that's why we're all here.
By the way, this is not all my ideas. I cribbed this from David Harvey's brilliant A Brief History of Neoliberalism. So buy it from all good radical bookshops.
There we go. Now we know. Thank you so much for that recommendation. Dimitris, what have you got for us on transformative moments of an organization?
So I will get you back to, in fact, where Guy started this question, back in China at the 1800s.
Nice.
Because for me, one of the biggest transformations I can think of when you asked the question was actually the transformation of Qin Shi's pirate armada into one of the biggest commercial endeavors in the history of the world. This was a woman who started literally having a pirate armada so big that both the Portuguese, Spanish, British and Chinese Empire could not even put a dent into it to the point that their army was much bigger than the Chinese fleet, the whole fleet of China, to the point they were so powerful that essentially at some point said, you know what, you are going to give us all amnesty, complete and utter amnesty, and we're going to become a legal corporation that will actually be in fact controlling ports, which is unheard of in our day and time kind of thing. So for me, yeah, the idea of somebody who killed and murdered and stole and pillaged and destroyed everything in her power to make money, suddenly she could say, you know what, now we're legal and we're traders. For me, I couldn't imagine like even the logistics of controlling something like that and making actually a legitimate system out of this. It's amazing.
I love that. She just went legit. She woke up one day and she was like, I'm going legit, people.
It sounds like Terry Pratchett sort of stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Like the Assassin's Guild and the Thieves Guild. Yeah. That is just like the Grocers Guild. You know, it's just they're on the street and you have a contract with them. I love it. It's freaking amazing. All right, so what I have for you is I have two little ones that are very brief. Well, little. The first is the Lutheran Split with the Catholic Church. Very little, obviously. A man with big ideas took a piece of paper and a nail and changed the world. Just caused decades, hundreds of years. Even today, Lutherans, Protestants, Calvinists, you know, all of these sects of Christianity have different ideas. They've split and split and split and split, all from this one moment where a man stood up against the Catholic Church. And I know that there is an Orthodox Church and there were other schisms before then, but that was for us in Western culture. That was probably the big one, is when a man stood up and said, why is the church getting all of our money and living like kings when we're eating bugs and wearing rags, basically?
What of history are you reading, Janet?
So yeah, for me that was a really big one, and it's very much seen as sort of the victory for the common man against the princes of the church, essentially. And the second one I have for you is Knights Templar. I'm a little bit obsessed with them. I did a whole video on the Knights Templar because I think their organization is so fascinating in terms of like world building structure. But the big one for me is they went from this like protective knight service where they protected pilgrims going to the Holy Land into a bank. They turned into a bank, people. They went full bank, and as I'll talk later about their ignoble end, because that's my ignoble end version as well. My God, that bit them in the ass.
Yeah, that went down very quickly.
But yeah, that was two sort of moments, both funnily enough religious ones, where there was a massive change in an organization that had sort of huge international repercussions within Western Europe, which is my area.
My argument in 2008, when the bankers wanted a bailout, is that they needed to do the reverse. And if they wanted public money, they had to escort people to Jerusalem and back whenever they wanted to go.
I love this idea. Okay, that's my new favourite thing.
Yeah. Are you any good with a gun? No? Well, learn very quickly. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Or why Jerusalem? Why not Santiago de Compostela? Why not Canterbury Cathedral? All pilgrimages.
Wherever you want to go, Lords, you know.
Oh yeah. Oh my goodness. I love this idea. Okay, so we've talked about the beginnings of organizations, and we've talked about changes within organizations. Folks in the chat, I forgot to tell you earlier, as it is so standard on our channel, but if you have a question, write in capital letters question and then your questions, and I'll be answering those questions with my fine guests at about the 45-minute mark. So that's about 25 minutes or so, 20 minutes or so, sorry. But in the meantime, let's talk about propaganda. Organizations like to tell everyone who they are, or maybe they don't. Maybe they have a front. They have often insignias, they have mottos, they have heraldry and standards. And this can be the case for many kinds of organizations. What I have asked my beautiful guests here is ideas of mottos or insignias or heralds, or all three, if you want to give me all three, which are interesting, unusual, different, pertinent, or just very, very cool world building examples. Who haven't I started with? Nick, I haven't started with you. Talk to me.
Well, propaganda's a funny one, isn't it, really? Because a lot of the time you find out it's less effective than you think. One of the great ironies with Hitler is that many Germans found his propaganda speeches extremely boring and sort of tuned out, and it's almost as if he was ranting on the radio like a teacher in a classroom, and then saying, "So what was I saying there? What was I saying? Oh, the triumph of the will and something." And and a lot of this kind of a lot of the sort of the kind of the propaganda devices. When you do GCSE history, there's a whole section that you do the Nazis, and you go, I have to teach it every year. Frankly, Hitler's last crime is that to me he's boring.
Bad painter and just boring general.
Yeah, this boring little man.
Awful man. Why did he go to hell? He was boring.
Anyway. So there's a whole chapter that says, talks about propaganda, or they brainwash people. Well, they don't really, because people don't become brainwashed. Even when people are watching hours and hours of advertising, they're still critically engaging with the thing they're looking at. They're filtering it, going, do I like that? Do I not? Brainwashing people is, if it happens at all, is a very complicated business. You can't. So, in a way, what I like, going back to things like for example, the Knights Templar, their kind of iconography, and their various kind of ways of communicating their status and their significance. That to me, in world building terms, is more important and interesting, because often in organizations like that, what they weren't trying to do is say, here is our big idea, follow it. What they were trying to do is say, you actually, a lot of what we do is hidden. A lot of what we do is not on display. A lot of what we think and say is not for you, the plebs on the streets. It is part of a kind of a set of codes that people like us, normally kings and popes, understand. And that's who we're talking to. So in a roundabout way, I think in world building terms, those are the more useful sorts of ideas.
Absolutely. Although I love that you brought that up, because 2 men, 1 horse is absolutely the icon of the Knights Templar. The idea is they're so poor that they can't even have their own horse. This was one of the richest organizations in Western Europe in the medieval period.
I know, they weren't like Russian 19th century terrorists who generally, they so it's interesting. We come back to that one, isn't it? But yeah.
But it's very interesting that what they're portraying is not necessarily who they were after the organization had changed, essentially. And I love that about that example, particularly that you brought up, is that there is a disparity between what they're trying to show to the public and who they are, both in terms of secrecy and in terms of how they're portraying themselves. They portray themselves as poor monks as well. The non-knights of the Knights Templar, so the non-military wing, wore very simple monk-like clothes. But again, they were the richest people in the whole world ever.
You couldn't have kings finding out you had a quid or two.
Exactly. Yeah.
What I mean, one of the kind of the sort of the drivers of medieval anti-Semitism, the ghettoization of Jews into things like finance and lending, and which is what they basically weren't allowed to do other kinds of things. And so kings thought, you're easy to bully because you're a minority here in France or in the Holy Roman Empire. You've got the money. I'm not allowing you to do other kinds of economic activity because I want to come and beat you up periodically using the angry mob to extort money out of you. So if you did have pots of cash and you had kings that liked to fight crusades, it was better to keep this on the down low as much as possible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I beg your pardon, we're getting some feedback there. Yeah, absolutely, you're totally right. Dimitris, what do you have for me on iconography, insignias, standards?
So I have a motto for you, in fact.
Ooh, love it.
It is Festina Lente. Festina Lente is the motto of the Medici. What most people do not know, actually it means haste slowly, but most people do not know is actually that they borrowed it, and not that they borrowed it once. This motto was borrowed so many times. Actually, it started in ancient Greece, in Athens. So festina lente was a quote that was used by the Roman Emperor Augustinus, and before that it was used in fact by Alexander the Great and his father, and before that it was used in Athens. In Athens, of course, the whole idea was that. Do you know about the idea that ancient Greeks believed that pan metron ariston, which means actually everything in a good measure? That was the idea.
Moderation.
Exactly. And festina lente and haste slowly is actually part of that. It's like, be quick, but be thoughtful of what you're doing. And what fascinated me about that is that a quote and a motto is actually being used to ascribe to the organization the properties of the predecessors that used it. Because King Augustus, like Emperor Augustine, essentially, was supposed to be somebody who was very smart with his money and also very entrepreneurial. Like, that was the idea. Essentially, he had a lot of ideas for reformations and changes in essentially the way that things were done. And before that, actually, Alexander the Great was also saying, you have to go fast, or we have to be thoughtful about what we're doing and where we're doing. So it's very interesting that they kind of said, okay, now this is our motto. We're translating in our language so people understand it, which was Latin back then, but we keep on ascribing to ourselves the knowledge and the wisdom of the predecessors of us that used it before.
I love that. I love the fact that it's not only a very pertinent motto, but it's a motto with so much history, and that history is, again, it's reception history. It's seen from the past, it's seen as valued, and sometimes it's sort of reinterpreted to be useful for the present day. There is a phrase in Italian, by the way. It's one of my favorite phrases. It's chi va piano va sano che va lontano. The one who goes slowly and wisely will go for a long time. Like, he's gonna be fine. So it's been translated into a modern Italian idiom as well. It's a bit longer, obviously, but yeah, that's why the restaurant chain Va Piano is called Va Piano.
Cool.
So now you know.
I want pasta.
Do English schools have mottos? Because my school in South Africa, we had a motto: "Arge quadagis," reach for the stars. Which
I like that.
We used to say that all the time. We had a rampant lion holding a star. That was our school badge. And then Arge quadagis. I mean, it's stuck with me forever. I mean, I haven't been in school for 30 years, but it was drummed into us. Reach for the stars. Anyway, sorry. Just
no. British schools absolutely do have mottos.
So, I mean, that's S Club 7's motto as well, isn't it? And you know, they turned out all right, didn't they? But some British schools do, don't they? You know.
Yeah, my school certainly had mottos. Can I remember them? I cannot. I studied Latin, but I did not study our school motto because it did not interest me. But Guy, talk to us more about mottos, insignias, standards, and the like.
I like propaganda because it's always fun, because it's propaganda if you lose. If you win, it's the truth, usually. I mean, that's what it becomes ultimately. I mean, if talk about Hitler, I mean, Triumph of Will, which was his propaganda film, or it wasn't his film, it was made by a filmmaker called Leni Riefenstahl. It's still banned in many countries to watch it in totality as a film, and it's a silent film. I mean, it's got music, but there's no voiceover. It's very, very, very powerful from that perspective. But he didn't make it; he just authorized it and starred in it, obviously. Anyway, that's a different kettle of fish. No, propaganda I want to talk about is propaganda from the 1920s and the 1930s in Hollywood.
Interesting.
And it involved wigs worn by the men. So if you were an actor in Hollywood, whether you were male or female, specifically though if you were men, you had a wig, and there was an entire division of wig makers dedicated just to making wigs for the male actors. And a very famous actor, Errol Flynn, was making a film in 1933 called Robin Hood, and he begged the studio, please, can I use my own hair instead of wearing a wig? And the studios went, no, you will wear a wig. And they wore the wigs, and that's why when you watch all of those old films, their hair always has that particular wave and is always perfect, because it quite literally is a wig. It's been styled and sewn on top of their heads. But that was the beginning of the star system that Hollywood engaged in. And when you signed a contract as an actor for a studio, you didn't sign for a film, you signed for the studio. And if the studio wanted you to become a star, they determined whom you dated, whom you went out with and were seen with, and where you lived and what type of car you drove and what you wore outside of the film, because that was part of the system of generating stars. So we had these amazing lifestyles, which were completely staged, where you would be hired to be the friend of this actor or actress because they couldn't be seen to be alone on this holiday. So they needed to have lots of people at their house. They didn't know any of them. They were extras, quite literally hired for the pantomime. So it was very, 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 very effective for a very long time, until the 1960s, when people like Shirley Maclaine started to fight back. And then she started to sue producers and things and said, I will marry who I want to marry, because of course she used to marry lots of different people, which the studios didn't like because divorcees were not popular in the 60s. But anyway, I mean, it's very interesting how it's a very subtle form of control, and it's almost like presenting poster children for an entire industry, but on a massive scale, and for nearly 40 years or so.
We do still have that.
Yeah,
like,
I was going to say,
to a large degree, yes.
particularly
We
in
do.
spaces like K-pop. So this is very, very... So
Yes.
in Korean pop music, for example, this is still absolutely the case. Forgive me shifting around in my chair. It's still absolutely the case that people are assigned girlfriends. They're assigned hobbies. They're assigned things that they like, favourite colours, things they can wear, things that they say. They are... It's a very, very prescriptive brand that is built around a human being to convey things. And if two people are too similar, there's a problem, because there has to be like, it's like the Spice Girls. Like, there's a reason the Spice Girls were built, so there was a sporty one and a blonde one and a, I don't know, a cayenne pepper flavored one. I can't remember, but they were built so that they seemed like 5 different personalities. So at least one of them would appeal to a demographic, right? To a sub-demographic. And this is absolutely still done today, terrifyingly enough.
I just have this wonderful idea of this young Korean teenager being saying, you're going to be friends with Cary Grant, you know, and James Mason. They're going to be your buddies. But did anybody ever see the documentary about Whitney Houston that Nick Broomfield made? Really, really interesting. It was just to continue this point about why ultimately she was very unhappy in her life, and why ultimately essentially drugs and untimely death featured. This is essentially a black bisexual, if not actually gay, woman who was forced to live a heterosexual life, largely by her family and by the record companies. And she wanted to make black music, but really was forced through record companies to make kind of rather frothy white audience music in the 1980s. And it comes back to this deep question of, I mean, what Guy was talking about there, and what you were talking about there with the Spice Girls, this question of identity in the artist, of, you know, if you have this creative urge inside you, and yet you're forced to live a life that is not yours and is not authentic to you. It's a kind of torture, really. Just to go on a total sidetrack. But I think the documentary is called When Can I Be Me? And it's really, really good. Very, very powerful.
Fascinating.
I think that goes all back to the idea that, in fact, organizations can have a much bigger pool, a much wider pool than we think in our lives and the lives of the people who are actually part of them. Because you actually talked about the family of Whitney Houston, I think you said, but yes, families, especially powerful families, are organizations, and they have very complicated and very complex structures, in fact.
They do.
Absolutely. And I think internal pressures within organizations, particularly for world building, is a fascinating thing to understand. Are you too tall, too white, too low class, upper class, French, and red-headed for this organization? And do you have to change yourself, or will the organization make you change yourself if you want to be a part of it? Are you allowed to be a part of it? Organizations can be as exclusive as they can be inclusive, and it really sets a tone for an organization. It can be fascinating when you're world building one. Can
you imagine? Apply to the Adventurers Guild, but you must be 6'2", blonde hair, blue-eyed, and be able to bench press 240 pounds. If you can't, go join the scribes or the wizards or the other fat kids, whatever. Yeah. This is our brand. If you're a hero, you have to wear this particular model of armor. You have to use that particular sword manufacturer.
We are sponsored by Lusty Armor. Only people wearing Lusty Armor may apply to our guild.
Exactly. St. George's personal brand on each plate. Yeah.
You know what? People did used to put brands on people.
Yeah.
Like, for example, the Viking kings used to actually have branding their warriors with their insignia and their actually like their house to show actually the allegiance and fealty.
Okay, I'm gonna take this away to another space now and share my Insignia Motto. You all know I love puns, so I wanted to share canting arms. In the field of heraldry, there is a particular part of heraldry which is visual puns, alright? So if your name is Flowers, you might have a bag of flour, or if you're a miller, you might also have, like, pictures of flowers on your heraldic crest, because you're a miller, so you make flour, so then you have flowers, get it? Punny punny, on your crest. This happened a lot, but my favourite example of this is a chicken in trousers. I will share it with you. There is a village in Holland called Hensbroek. Hen, as in English, is chicken. Broek is from the German brook, like stream. But broek in Dutch means trousers. And so the insignia for this village, as was set in 1827, I think, or something, is a chicken wearing a pair of trousers, and it is my favourite piece of heraldry that I have ever found in the whole world. Just to remind you all that puns are amazing, and you don't need to be serious all the time when you're world building.
Because people are not.
I have
Absolutely, yeah.
just shared the Wikipedia article on canting arms. It's very, very interesting. You can go and take a look, and the chicken in trousers does feature in there. So, yeah, feel free, go crazy, do weird stuff. People absolutely use puns and funny things. Terry Pratchett's motto for the Unseen University is Ita Beta Pi, as in the Greek letters, because it sounds like eat a better pie, and they all eat lots of food. That's part of the culture there. They all grossly indulge themselves. So
I like this.
Yeah, don't feel like you always have to be serious. Sometimes you can just do things because it's funny. It's okay. And honestly, having that light and dark in your world, even if your world is a very serious world, having shades of light will enhance that seriousness in your world building, so you don't end up with, like, the dark was in the dark and then it was dark and then there were no lights. Nothing shows up in that. So you really need that. You really need that sort of array in your tone, in your world building. And it can be a bad joke. That's okay. It's allowed to be a bad joke. Make some jokes sometimes. But I see we are going on a pace and we have very little time. Let's talk about catastrophes. Ends. Doom. Dimitris, talk to us about an astonishing end or an ignoble end.
I have an ignoble end to you.
Love it.
You know, like, when you think of Sparta, what do you think of? You think of, like, massive heroes, like muscly men with, like, amazing armor and like that. Do you know how Sparta ended? Like, literally by ended, I mean how it actually, like, ended completely and utterly. Sparta at some point was ransacked by the Visigoths. Alaric, if you know Alaric, essentially the Great. Alaric took the whole population of Sparta and made slaves out of them. And that was it. End. Period. There were some people who were actually around the area that actually later on will create Mistra and other big, like, locations around there in the Peloponnese. But the whole city of Sparta was ransacked and everybody was enslaved in a single attack. End.
Wow. Wow.
If we had more time, I'd want to know more.
That's for the after party with wine. Guy, talk to us. Ignoble ends or astonishing ends or just ends.
Yeah, you know, there are lots of ends. Things do come to an end often, and I was trying to think of ignoble ends, but the one that comes to my mind as a big cautionary tale, and it's I wish I could say that I sort of allocated this as an end myself, but it's from a book called Collapse by Jared. I think it's Jared Diamond who wrote it. Is the end of the Easter Islanders.
Oh.
Who quite literally cut down the last tree to move their giant statue signifying how brilliant they were, and then realized that they were a nation of people who survived by building fishing boats out of wood, and now they've cut down their last tree before building a fishing boat, so they started to starve to death until Captain Cook came along and found them all quite literally having turned to cannibalism. So that was to me, that's like, did no one kind of go, hey, listen, because it's not a big island. I mean, it's big, but it's not that big. Did no one go, you know what? There's no trees left. Should we really cut this one down? Do you think it's a good idea? Yeah, it's got to move that head. Oh, all right. Cut it down then. Now we start becoming, I don't know what we're going to do now. Anyway, so that was the end of Easter Island as a culture, was they chopped down the last tree.
Lack of foresight as an end of an organization.
There's a pun in there about cutting down your last tree despite your giant stone head, sort of like your nose despite your face, but I'm not smart enough to figure it out.
Despite your giant face. I like it. I like it. Nick, talk to us about the end of an organization.
Well, the end of an organisation I've been focusing a lot in my reading at the moment is the end really of French colonialism in Vietnam, the Battle of the Dien Bien Phu. And the French were finding it increasingly difficult to hold on to the north of Vietnam, which was forming itself into the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So they said, right, we're going to put a huge expeditionary force into the north to control a particular site where there's an airfield and where we can control the land around it. And they flew in, I think it was about 12,000 troops, and the French in Vietnam didn't actually have enough troops because they thought the bulk of our soldiers have to remain in France in case there's a Soviet invasion of Europe. So when they got there, somebody said, hang about, there are mountains all around us. What if the North Vietnamese were to put cannons on those mountain tops? And the French general in charge basically said, don't be daft. They couldn't get them up the mountains. I mean, and we've colonized these people. We're obviously superior, they're inferior, and we've colonized them, and they just couldn't do that. But that's exactly what they did. And they said, well, where are they going to get all these cannons and rocket launchers from anyway? And the answer was, of course, across the border in newly communist China. So the French basically sat there in the valley for several months and had shell after shell rain down upon them. And one of the generals said, no, we'll as soon as we see their cannons firing, we'll fire back and we'll knock them out. But that didn't work because they were out of range. And so the French back home looked at all this and said, much as the Americans would do later, why on earth are we fighting war in Vietnam? This is expensive and a waste of time and a waste of money. Let's call the whole thing off. The MRP, the Movement Républicain Populaire government was swept from power. The socialists came to power and said, right, pull the plug. And that was the end of France in Vietnam.
Wow.
Beginning with a fairly unworkable military campaign.
Very dramatic, and some good world building lessons to be learned from that one.
Never wage a war from a valley.
There we go. I suggest anybody should read Sun Tzu's Art of War. I think he mentioned something similarly. Fighting uphill, always bad idea in general. Yeah. We don't like fighting uphill. Downhill, yes. So I mentioned earlier that my entry for this was going to be Knights Templar. Knights Templar had accrued huge amounts of debt because they were basically a bank by the end of their by the height, I should say, of their organization, and particularly the French king owed a huge amount of money to the Knights Templar. What did he do? He started a smear campaign. It was a very pointy, Bernie smear campaign. He said, they're all devil worshippers and homosexuals, which was illegal at that point. We don't like that, but it was. Sorry, history is full of things that we don't like very much. And so they burned them all at the stake. Yeah. A huge number of them fled. They joined other religious orders, which were not secretly banks, and French royalty did not owe huge amounts of money to. Knights of St. John, the Order of St. Lazarus was one. There were lots of these sort of smaller, the Teutonic Knights was another one, these smaller sort of military religious orders, essentially, that once Christianity had lost a foothold within the Holy Land, that was Jerusalem, essentially, at that point, they gave themselves sort of secondary targets. Like, they failed the main objective, but they picked up a different side quest and they were pursuing that. So the Knights of the Teutonic Order were like, let's just found a nation. And they made Prussia. And the Knights of St. John were like, let's try and take the Holy Land anyway. And they failed again and again and again. It got pushed back further and further over the Mediterranean until they landed in Malta. They were like, this looks nice, let's stay here. And the natives were like, wait, that's mine. Why is this happening? So that's, sorry, the brief history of the Mediterranean there. Yeah, essentially, I'm moving the window. Essentially, they were bankers who did too well, and royalty revolted, which is what happens when important people owe you money, apparently. So the moral of that story is don't lend money to people who can't pay it back and are very, very powerful and have an army. Number one. Number two, your organizations can end in a single strike from somewhere you didn't expect, because they certainly weren't expecting that. My goodness, no. It was a very much a left field situation that they had not seen. I'm sure they were kicking themselves as they burnt, but yeah, what are you going to do? On that very overacted historical anecdote, I think it's time to jump to your questions, and I'm going to be randomly picking from my guests, although guests, at this point, we have no plan. If you want to answer a question, just stick your hand up, and I shall ask you. I have to adjust everybody's volumes every time somebody speaks, because I've got the volume balancing wrong. So yeah, just give me a minute here. Thank you for your patience over in the audience. Mask Spowkeeper has asked us a lot of questions, but they all seem to be World Anvil technical questions. I suggest you tune in to our webinar that goes live on Tuesday at the same time that this started, or ask us on Discord, or ask in the help channel where we can give you help. But now we are talking about the history of organizations. Keijatan asks, what tropes or cliches in organizations are overused? Question mark. Who wants to answer this one? Hands up, children. Guy, talk to us.
The evil ruler.
Ooh, like it.
I think in organizations are always overused. I mean, it's always the head of the organization is the one who's plotting the downfall of the world. The head of the organization, yeah, they might do that, and certainly they have the power to do that, but having worked for many very large organizations, I can promise you there are lots of little divisions that could be doing lots of evil things without the head knowing anything at all. So I think that's one of the most overused ones is, oh, the head of the giant organization is evil, and once you destroy them, the entire organization crumbles and collapses, and it's like, no, it's definitely not how it works.
I love it.
But that would be my own.
Completely agree with the guy on that. Especially generally speaking, the idea that organizations, especially big ones, are homogeneous. It is not the case at all. In fact, the bigger the organization, the more disparity and the more actually breaking and different ideas you will see. Even an organization like, for example, I remember, what was it? Like in Pathfinder, there's an organization that is like the guards of the demonic empire, essentially like the empire, the Kellish Empire, I think it's called. And effectively, they are the Black Hands or whatever they are called. I don't remember exactly. But effectively, the idea is that they are all completely lawful good, and they all always do the same thing. And that's not the case ever. Not even actually, even in organizations like the Knights Hospitalier, or for example, as Janet said, the Templar Knights, they had functions. In fact, the Hospitaliers had functions with names in them, like, and they had internal conflict, and they have internal counseling and internal actually little small councils there. When you build organizations, don't consider them that, you know, they are for specifically one alignment and they have all the same idea. There might be a guidance currently given by a leader, but what they want to do and what actually happens is a completely different issue altogether.
Fantastic, absolutely. Anything to add to that, Nick?
Well, I would say the overused trope that I'd like to see less of is the kind of the restoration trope, that there's the kingdom in disarray, and the king, who happens to be like a reluctant king or wandering around as a ranger somewhere, can return and restore the land and restore the spirit of the people. It's actually in kind of modern parts, it's kind of one of the more kind of fascistic sort of tropes going, of the kind of the inspired leader who will return and set the nation to rights and probably persecute the right sorts of people, you know, that kind of thing. So if I could have a fantasy world where there are sort of fewer, not to diss Lord of the Rings, but fewer Aragorn kind of stories, I think that would be it would take things in a more interesting direction. Put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Tolkien, a lot of what is in Tolkien, people saw it and thought that looks great, so then they used it. It was the starting point for a lot of us for fantasy. And I think a lot of those things in Tolkien which weren't tropes have become tropes. That's how it works. A cliche is a cliche because people use it, right? Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. I would like to say the centralization of power, particularly centralization of power in the monarchy. There's this thing called, Dimitris can remind me of the name, Crown Authority, right? Yes, Crown Authority.
Yes.
Where it's the amount of pull that a king actually has at any point. People either create Crown Authority that is super, super high and the king is this absolute ruler who could do everything. People just do what he says. Or they create Crown Authority that is really, really low and they have a king who can't do anything and his dukes are pushing him around. And so it's one extreme or the other. And I would say exploring that in a more complex way, in the kaleidoscope of power, would be very interesting because it's like either you've got high crown authority, absolute ruler, or you've got low crown authority and it's friggin' chaos and the secretary like pushes the king around and it's fine. What's your thoughts?
You're absolutely right, first of all, but I would like to get people to consider that during the medieval times, the king of a nation in most cases did not have the majority of the army. It was practically one of the dukes that the other dukes decided, you know what, you kind of can actually lead us because of X, Y, or Z reason. The royal crowns of England, of Europe especially, were built on concession. This is the game of politics. You give me something, I give you something in return, and that was how the system worked. And that's why in most cases actually taxation was not going to the king, it was going to the dukes. And some other concessions were made actually, for example, you can get the wool tax, for example, king, just to give you something extra kind of thing. But in truth, you have to understand that politics, especially in organizations, are much more important because people need each other. You wouldn't have an organization if they didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, this problem emerging during the Wars of the Roses, this concept of bastard feudalism, where if you were to ask a peasant in Worcestershire, whose man are you? Previously, he would say, well, I'm, King Henry's man. But during the decline of the power of, say, Henry VI, he would say, well, I'm the Duke of Hereford's man because I wear his livery. And that at that point, when the crown becomes so weak, then nobles will instinctively fight for the crown to take the throne, and you wind up with 3 decades of like an on-off civil war. So that is where power becomes diffuse in the other direction. And Henry VII, after the end of the Wars of the Roses, his job was really about restoring the power of the crown.
Consolidation. Yeah.
Absolutely, and a lot of the iconography then becomes super important at that point. So Richard III, who I know a ridiculous amount about because my mother dug him up, is represented by the boar, and he gave out these silver and pewter boars to everybody who fought for him, so that they knew who they were. Essentially, it's a very, very interesting time where there wasn't radio, there wasn't TV, you couldn't just be part of a Facebook group. This is a point where heraldry becomes incredibly important because it's a way to define who you are and who your people are. But I would like to point out that we have a lot of questions, and that was just one. This always happens. It's because
good question, though.
You guys here on the stream are interesting and you guys here on the chat are interesting, and that's what happens. We talk about stuff. Let's get through some of these a little bit speedier. Mark McKinnon asks, what is the key to when a religion becomes a more politicized organization? And how do you represent this in a game or a world? ? This is a game question. Guy, what are your thoughts?
When a religion becomes a political organization.
Yeah, or a more politicized force, essentially.
Well, I think we need not turn any further than Star Wars. That's what the Jedi were, effectively. They were this religious group, if you like. I mean, it's difficult to call them a religion because they had the Force. It wasn't something that they had to believe in. It was there. But they became very politicized and were effectively doing stuff on the side which they shouldn't have been doing, depending on what you believe. But the whole idea of historical sort of Catholicism is that they were entrenched in all of the runnings of countries anyway, by manipulating Cardinal Richelieu, for example, sort of manipulating the strings of France and so on. So from a gaming perspective, I'm not entirely sure I understand where the question is. It's how do we make a political organization?
Represent it within a game or a world?
There was an interesting game called what was it called now? Santiago. Anyway, you had to influence the Doge of a city in Italy to basically vote for your party, your political party. And so you did things for the Doge in order for him to recognize you as being the most contributory company in that particular town. And as a result, he gave you religious authority. So that's quite a good way of bringing that in, is that by being given the blessings of whatever religious organization you have, you gain authority as being the more appropriate route to take. So if Coca-Cola was endorsed by the Pope, for example, rather than Albany bread, then Coca-Cola would do better than, give us our daily bread becomes give us our daily Coca-Cola. So
Coca-Cola, I like it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there we go. You see, really, you're on the right track. So I don't know. That would be my take: is trying to gain influence points basically with religion in order to gain political favor.
Sure. I mean, I would argue very succinctly that a religion becomes an organization. Sorry, a religion becomes political when it becomes an organization. It's where it goes from the coagulation of beliefs and rituals and cultures to an organization. I would say that's the moment it becomes politicized. But Nick, you're about to add something.
Well, I was I totally agree with that, Janet. And one quick win on this subject is: do you have a theocracy in your game world? If you look at sort of moments of intense politicization of religion, look at, for example, the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, where the mullahs and imams in Iran had always had a huge amount of political power. They were very important political players, and elected politicians in Iran when they had those before 1953, and the various shahs of Iran had to listen to them, and they were often rabble rousers and populists, and they could cause all sorts of trouble by saying in mosques, the Shah's doing this apparently, and this is really bad, or this politician is going to destroy our country, and he's in league with the devil and all that kind of stuff. But following the Iranian Revolution, obviously Iran becomes an Islamic republic where the state and the religion become intertwined in a way that they hadn't done before. So you might find that in your game world you have a religion that takes a step forward from just being a powerful player within a society to defining the society by creating a theocratic state.
Absolutely fascinating.
I do think, just quickly, Janet, if you don't mind, just quickly, the biggest challenge that you have in a game world, though, is that unlike the real world here, where the power is given to the religious organization by the people who worship that particular religious movement, in a game world where you actually do have deities who do manifest power on the planet and who imbibe power into the practitioners, it is a bit of a different game though, because it's not the worshippers giving the power to the imams, for example. Here it really is these 25 different gods who are all deranged giving power down, and then that filters down to the people. So it does change the perspectives in terms of your literature on how to run the organization is now very much divine directed from a provable perspective. I mean, not to tread too much on modern day religion, but that's a big difference as well.
So a better example would be, for example, the way in which religion functioned politically in, say, ancient Greece, when there's a kind of a pantheon, and it's believed that Greek gods are there and make direct interventions into everyday life.
Right.
So go and research that.
Fantastic. There we are. And our final question for the evening is from Ignis Incendia, who asks, what, in your opinion, would be the strangest way for a town to be founded? Dig into your imaginations, guys. Find something weird. You've stumped them all. I'm going to say Cthulhu sneezed. There you are. Weirdest way for a town to be founded. Cthulhu burst into our realm, sneezed, disappeared.
And the town was founded...
Filled with bogeymen. There you go. That's the strangest random thing I can think of off the top of my head. What have you got for me, people?
The strangest random thing.
We're here for inspiration, Guy.
Okay, I would say the strangest random thing is that there was a particular spot in the field where a particular shepherd was standing where it did not rain, whereas everywhere else in the field it rained, and so the shepherd decided that this was the ultimate holy of holies, for it was dry, and as a result formed his basis for his town right there on that spot.
I love that. Spoken like a man who lives in the UK where it's terribly damp. Dimitris, what are your thoughts? Actually, Nick, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, a mage in an experiment opens a wormhole to Britain in 1972 into the front room of a family watching David Bowie doing Starman on the television on Top of the Pops for the first time. And they just see this image for a moment of Bowie in his glittery outfit with his guitar, his arm around Mick Ronson. It's all considered very controversial at the time. And he assumes that he has seen the face of God. And he draws down what he sees. And he creates this town called Ziggy. And writes down the words to Starman that he can remember as the sort of the prayer of the people there, and he attracts pilgrims across, and they have statues of Bowie. And sometimes he recreates the experiment. He recreates the experiment and opens the wormhole, and they see different moments of Bowie's career, his Berlin years, his moment when he did Tin Machine in the 1980s, which shocked and horrified everybody, and later his more established work in the 1990s. And they believe that they're looking at the face of God, but they keep saying, well, why do you keep going through these changes? And they manage from this other reality to get Bowie's back catalogue of albums and go through the sleeve notes and create an entire religion based on David.
That was the most extended and bizarre answer I could possibly have not expected. Dimitris, what have you got to add to that? The weirdest founding of a town.
I'm stumped after this, by the way, but I have to admit, I don't know how to answer that. I feel quite overwhelmed by that. I would say the weirdest way of building a town. Building a whole building tool and suddenly realizing that the tool is actually above 800,000 people and has the size of a town, and everybody has the same cause and reasons to actually do things and the same, way to work together to actually achieve them. So yes, building a town online out of nowhere because his wife wanted to write a book.
I love that. The strangest way to build a town, accidentally build one through World Anvil. All right, folks, we have given you history. We have given you Dadaism. What more could you possibly ask? Guy, who are you and where can we find you?
You can find me on the website www.greatgamemaster.com, and that will link you to everything and everywhere, because we're everywhere, and anything that has to do with role-playing and telling stories in role-playing or through role-playing or with it's role-playing. It's there. Go find it.
It's what Guy does. So Guy, of course, is the face of the GreatGM channel, and he's an award-winning GM. He's a screenwriter. He does all things awesome. He also, yes, exactly. He's showing off the goods. Dimitris, who are you and where can we find you?
Well, most of the time I'm around here or in the bed about 5 meters away from here, honestly. You find me here coding World Anvil pretty much at worldanvil.com, where my wife is as well. Hello, wife.
Hello, Spoon. And Nick, who are you and where can we find you?
Well, I'm one of the creators of Arclands. You can find Arclands on World Anvil. And you can check us out on Kickstarter. Kickstarter's finished now and was a massive success. Thank you very much. And we're going to be putting our Arclands Player's Companion online for retail purchases later in the year. But if you want to check us out and get updates, you can follow us at Verse Home on Twitter.
Yep, absolutely. That link will be in the chat momentarily, and also the link of Arclands over on World Anvil, where you can find some amazing things. Nick even did a blog on what he calls retail magic, a guest blog on the World Anvil blog, which is truly fantastic. If you go to blog.worldanvil.com, you will be able to find it, as well as many other blogs on diverse things. But the evening is not over. Just before we go to Raid Kaora, who is a premium map maker, I have to thank Emperor Charles II for the subs, Basic Dragon and the Tyros campaign for the bits, a whole bunch of follows, so many I don't think I can read them all out, for the hosts, the DAT network. And folks, stay in your seats if you are on Twitch, because the magic of the raid will take you there. If you are on YouTube and you fancy a good map making chill out stream, go to twitch.tv/Kaora. That will appear in the chat momentarily. And you can see one of our favourite map makers who made this map and the map behind Dimitris, mapping some stuff and chatting around. Folks, shout out Light Up the Forge to let him know that we sent you. And in the meantime, grab your hammer and go world build.
World build.
Love you all, folks. See you soon. Bye.